This is the story of John Templeton, a boy from Tennessee who was taught to think differently, to see the world in terms of what was possible instead of what was not. Iconoclast, legendary investor, spiritual traveler, seeker of God, contrarian. Harvey and Bella Templeton of Winchester, Tennessee, welcomed their new son, John, in November of 1912. From early on, Bella instilled in John, as well as his older brother, Harvey, a great sense of adventure and curiosity.
Bella is a well-educated woman, which was a little unusual for sort of down-home Tennessee.
She took them on trips across country.
New York and Philadelphia, down the coast.
She had an adventurous spirit, and clearly this influenced Uncle John.
Bella gave the boys, both of them, free rein and the means to do with the world what they wanted to do.
In Winchester, at that time, you could go into a hardware store and buy sticks of dynamite, and they would walk down the street.
And go blow stumps out of the field.
Kaboom!
It was great.
I think what he loved most about his mother was the fact that she allowed him to be independent.
John's father, Harvey Templeton, was a serial entrepreneur.
John's father was a kind of a self-made lawyer.
He created a cotton gin business.
He was involved in lots of different business ventures.
Certainly my grandfather was very entrepreneurial.
His office was up above a bank that overlooked the courthouse. When property came up for auction, he would buy it very cheap.
Then he talked to the farmer. I'd like you to stay there, don't move. I own it, but this is your home.
And I think Uncle Johnny learned a lot from his father about that.
John followed in his father's footsteps, hunting for bargains and displaying the beginnings of great entrepreneurial spirit. His first business of note was at the age of 8.
He used to buy a lot of firecrackers and sell them to his friends.
He sent away to Ohio to a major production plant and got 3 giant boxes back, and he sold them for 3 times what he paid for.
He also dabbled in automotive interests, rebuilding a broken-down Ford purchased for $10 when he was 12.
He and his friends were driving way before they were 16 years of age.
They bought a Hupmobile, and then they found another Hupmobile that they could take parts from.
They combined them all into one vehicle.
And ended up with a car that would go to Cowan 6 miles away every 3rd try.
And at the age of 17, John's entrepreneurial spirit extended into the production of a not too delectable but otherwise serviceable Tennessee wine.
They bought a keg of raisins, and the keg of raisins comes with a sticker on it. It says, "Warning, do not add water and sugar to these raisins or it will turn to wine." Literally, the sign said that. They slipped out there one night to sample their goodie and pulled the lid off of it and stuck a ladle down in there. And Uncle John took a big sip. He said, it's got lumps and stuff in it. It was full of bugs.
John's father tapped his entrepreneurial spirit, promising the young Templeton cotton bales in exchange for good grades.
Grandfather had promised Dad that if he got in all A's in every report card, he would be given on credit a bale of cotton. And that was real money in those days.
When it came time to think about college, John, with his steadily growing single-mindedness, decided only one college would do.
Uncle John asked a local farmer where the best college in the world was.
The man said, Yale College.
One of the things that was required was a math course, which they didn't offer.
So John went to the principal of the high school and said,
Sir, I need this course. And the principal was, well, John Marks, if you can get 5 other students, and if you teach the course, and if you all pass the final exam, then I will certify the course.
He taught the course, they all learned it, and they could pass tests on it.
From a very early age, he was identified in Tennessee for having a kind of maturity about him.
And a farmer who must have been 70, walking down the road, said, "Are you John Marks's boy?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, you know that John Marks, he was born old."
There was a kind of a wisdom and a foresight and a future-mindedness in John Templeton.
He seemed to have direction. He didn't necessarily know what was at the end of the road, but he had a strong sense of direction.
Having worked so tirelessly to earn his place in New Haven, it soon looked like the Depression would send him right back home, because John's father could no longer afford tuition.
My grandfather was not the world's best businessman.
He speculated on the futures market in Chicago, and then he lost everything.
lost it all.
They were bust.
After his first year in college, his parent called him up and said he couldn't support him anymore, so he had to work his way through the rest of Yale.
My grandfather had to work 3 jobs in order to pay for school.
He always wanted savings. He believed in thrift. He didn't want to be unstable like his father.
John also developed another source of income to support himself.
Uncle Johnny was gambling his way through Yale to make ends meet.
He was able to make a lot of money, playing poker with some of the more wealthy kids at Yale.
His intelligence and mathematical abilities were such that he really understood probability.
You wouldn't have gotten a clue out of his face.
His poker face would be next to nobody. She didn't know what he was thinking.
Poker taught him the importance of taking measured, educated risks.
When to make a big investment and when not to.
And if it was today, they probably would not let him gamble at the casinos.
Through these efforts, John earned enough to pay his tuition through the rest of his years at Yale. And amazingly, almost in spite of them, did so well academically that he went on to become a Rhodes Scholar. John tried to study business at Oxford, but was told that gentlemen do not study business. So he studied law instead. But what was most notable about his Oxford experience was that he was able to travel extensively. Travel which was financed with poker winnings.
His travels took him to the 1936 Olympics.
He took a trip around the world, the Middle East, the Far East, China, Japan.
He went to various countries on deck passage, so he didn't pay for even a hammock because it was cheaper. He ran out of money in South France and went to Monte Carlo. He financed the rest of his trip.
He'd been gone for so long. His mother actually thought he had died. But he came back with this great bedrock of knowledge.
He had come from this small town in Tennessee and really hadn't seen the world. His eyes were opened.
When he returned to the United States, John had more than just a new global outlook. He was secretly engaged to Judith Dudley Folk, a Wellesley College graduate and debutante from Nashville. She was a charming and beautiful Southern belle who had once earned the title Most Dated.
Her dance card was always filled.
He found Judith's date book
And on one Saturday, she had 7 different dates.
She was very popular at Wellesley.
He had received a letter from someone when he was in Oxford that he better come home right away, because if he wanted to marry her, this was the time, or she was going to go off with somebody else.
Friends were writing to say, you know, we've found that Judith is engaged to 3 other men.
He always said, but I won. So he was determined, you know.
He was, I think, quite the Romeo.
When Uncle Johnny and Judith were dating, they would get in the car and drive around.
In a Stutz Bearcat.
It was a Pierce Arrow, which was a 4-seat convertible.
And sing Violate Me in Violet Time.
Violate me in violet time.
In the vilest way that you know. Ruin me, ravage me, utterly savage me. On me no mercy show. It was a great song.
He was very fun-loving.
Judith agreed to move into a 6th-floor walk-up outside of Harlem with John to save money.
They were in a cold water flat in New York.
They would save 50 cents on every dollar.
Furnishing their house largely by going around and finding stuff on the streets.
If they decided they wanted a really comfortable stuffed chair, well, they went to Goodwill. They didn't care one toot whether it fit any decor or anything.
Like John, Judith was not bound by convention. She worked full-time in advertising, which was unusual in those days for women.
She had her job, he had his.
She'd gone to college and she felt like she wanted to use it.
He was really enamored with the kind of person that she was.
Dad was proud that she was someone who wanted to carve out her own way.
I believe that he viewed women as fully capable as men.
John started his financial career at the investment firm of Finner and Bean, the predecessor firm to Merrill Lynch. Just prior to World War II, John looked at the market. He figured that many of the underperforming stocks would gain value if war were to break out.
His first major stock purchase was putting $10,000 into 104 penny stocks right before World War II.
He asked his boss at the time to front the money for him. The boss thought it was a bad idea, but he trusted John.
And by 1944, that $10,000 was worth $44,000. He was always trying to find things that were out of favor.
In 1940, he purchased a small investment firm which only advised 5 families, and it was called Templeton, Dobro, and Vance.
When he really started his investment management company, he didn't pay himself anything for 3 years. Nothing.
But then the business began to prosper, and he decided to surprise Judith with their very first vacation.
I remember the Christmas of 1950. I got my toys. My mother was looking around. I don't even see a box. And he says, look up in the tree. It was a 2-week vacation to Bermuda. They had motor scooters. And she was behind him. And a truck coming the other way clipped her on the side of the head. She was at the hospital and died 2 hours later.
It was a tragic accident.
It's difficult for a child to pick up how he was responding to those events because he wouldn't reveal anything.
In the most painful parts, he would not have said anything to others.
Judith's death affected Uncle John very deeply.
I don't know that he ever got over that.
After Judith's death, John threw himself even further into his work. It was his son, Kit, who brought the next love into his life, Irene Butler.
Well, we lived 2 houses away.
Kit used to go over there after school and have cookies and milk.
Irene was pretty considerate.
Kit was the one who invited my mother to tea, and so that kind of set the stage.
She loved him long before he was wealthy. She loved him for who he was.
John and Irene were married in 1958. The family now included Irene's 2 children, Malcolm and Wendy, as well as John's 3 kids, Jack, Candy, and Kit. And in an unusual move designed to bring them all together, the newlyweds decided to take the entire family, including several cousins, on their honeymoon.
We went on the Queen Mary to Europe.
And we were all between the ages of 11 and 19.
At the start of the trip, he told us, this is the amount of money that you have to spend on the trip.
And if we ran out of money, it was just going to be too bad. We wouldn't be eating then.
My parents sat in the back of the bus for 8 weeks, holding hands, probably clutching hands.
We stayed in youth hostels, and we ate a lot of bread and cheese. That was a very valuable lesson in thrift.
Thrift and looking for bargains, both home and abroad, would become hallmarks of John's investing career, which included the advent of the Templeton Growth Fund.
The fund was unique in that it looked all over the world for investments. It didn't confine itself to any market.
He pioneered global investing.
He was not parochial about being in the United States. His ability to look elsewhere made him really extraordinary.
He used common sense.
He was very inquisitive. He could absorb knowledge like a sponge.
Common sense ain't that common anymore.
In the late 1960s, John sold his advisory firm, but the buyer didn't want to purchase the Templeton Growth Fund because it was too small. So he kept it. Now in his mid-50s, he decided once and for all to get away from the herd mentality of Wall Street.
John was kind of the ultimate contrarian.
He moved, from Manhattan to the Bahamas. And one of the reasons to do that was he removed himself from the crowd.
Many people counseled him against this.
I was his first employee in Nassau, so it was Girl Friday. And he just then, of course, he'd only had the Templeton Fund.
The first Templeton office in the Bahamas was located in an attic space over the police station and a liquor store.
One of the things he said was that it's the safest place I could be. Who's going to break into a store that's right alongside the police station?
And everyone else had a skylight that leaked.
In 1974, John Galbraith joined Templeton.
John Galbraith said, look, let's work together. I'll distribute your funds.
It had some $13 million in it, so it was a teeny tiny fund.
That was a very, very important development for the success of the business.
And I said to John, I'll take on the marketing of this fund, and in 10 years, I'll have it up to $100 million.
That's when the talent started to come into the firm.
That was the beginning.
With Galbraith at the marketing wheel, money under management began to skyrocket, along with John's fame and reputation. He began appearing on the cover of Forbes and the Louis Rukeyser Show.
John Templeton remarked the other day, I am no wiser than I was 20 years ago, just better known.
Then everything expanded,
Soon the phone didn't stop ringing.
John was entrepreneurial by always doing what nobody else was doing.
When we were trading in Thailand and Singapore and countries that people didn't know exactly how we were even going to settle the trades, we were in the forefront.
John Templeton was way ahead of his time in the emerging markets.
He was investing in Korea before people were investing in Korea.
Japan, in the early 70s, was an emerging market.
Americans thought Japan could only make rinky-dink paper toys.
That's when John was building up his portfolio of Japanese stocks.
He had significantly underweighted the United States, and at that time, that was almost, heresy.
In the early days, I couldn't understand why he was going to these God-forbidden places, but he certainly was right.
There you go. The rest is history.
John was always looking around corners for opportunities. sometimes in the most unusual of circumstances, and often at the point of what John called maximum pessimism.
My stepfather had silver buried in an apple orchard in Ontario during the height of the Cold War.
He went to the bank and got as many silver dollars as he could.
He buried it so that any of us got to it, they would have something to get food and supplies with.
I received a letter my first year of college, and in the letter, it gave me instructions on how to get to the farm via the sewers.
Every crisis, John Templeton was in the midst of it.
There was the maximum pessimism. That was the buy signal.
John saw every downward turn in the market as an opportunity.
If a company is undervalued, he wanted to own it.
John's whole theory was you buy bargains.
Buy stocks that nobody else is buying.
Nothing presented a better opportunity for John than a market meltdown.
I was there in 1987.
When the market's down 15%, people were panicked beyond comprehension. We'd never seen anything like it.
John came down to the trading floor.
And it's unbelievable. John, what do we do? And he said, let's go find stocks to buy.
He was a quintessential American in a number of respects, and one of those is his built-in optimism.
The glass was always half full with Sir John.
He was never flustered. He was very disciplined, and he was very patient as an investor.
Stocks we bought, we held for a long time.
The length of a hold on a security will average 5 years.
Today, the average stock on the New York Stock Exchange is bought and sold in 28 seconds.
He was able to delay gratification in a way that really doesn't come naturally to many people at all, but he could really take it to a different level.
The late 90s brought another opportunity for John. Technology stocks were going through the roof. Everyone was buying. But not John. He started betting against the market, shorting tech stocks, which simply meant that he would only profit if the market soured.
It's very scary shorting a stock in a market like that. It can conceptually go up forever, so your losses are infinite.
It was a little bit like standing in front of a train. It was frightening.
Even though his paper losses mounted, John stuck to his convictions and doubled down.
He ended up doing incredibly, incredibly well. But he knew that the bubble would burst.
He predicted the crash of 08 and the housing bubble bursting.
Even then, he had the vision.
John always reminded me a little bit of Yoda.
In spite of his extraordinary financial success, John never wavered from his commitment to thrift.
He was not interested in the trappings of wealth.
He lived very humbly. Very simply, he traveled economy.
He would not go over and beyond where it wasn't necessary.
He never dressed like a millionaire or a rich man.
He probably wore the same lime green suit for about 24 years.
John was one of the very early adopters of light sensors.
There were timers on the lights in the bathroom.
Lights would just go out. You just could not reach that sensor from where you needed to turn the light on.
I think anybody in America that grew up in the Depression in some ways changed your DNA.
I wish Uncle Johnny's thrift would rub off on my children.
My wife says, no, I'm not thrifty, I'm cheap.
I once asked him, why are you so vigilant when it comes to savings? And he said, well, for opportunities, of course.
It gave him the funds necessary to take advantage of volatility in the stock market. He always had ready money.
Thrift was only one of John's many principles.
The key Templeton principles that John Templeton really defined for an entire generation of investors were, one, don't follow the crowd.
Buy low and sell high.
Buy at the point of maximum pessimism.
For years, people, even sophisticated analysts from Wall Street, would say, what is your investment approach? And he said, well, I just search for bargains, which is perfect Tennessee talk.
He had a way of making things very clear that were very complex.
I asked Uncle John one time, I said, now, when's the best time to invest? When you got the money. Well, what's the market going to do? It's going to go up and down.
The ability of communicating his philosophy and how it was so commonsensical to people attracted investors.
He had the golden touch. Everybody wanted to come and see him.
I once asked my uncle if I could see him. He said, well, I can give you a half an hour between 9:30 and 10, about 3 months down the road. So
First time I've got is April 2nd at 8:35. Not 8:30, 8:35.
Everything was very regimented.
He was all concentration.
It was work, work, work. He was very conscious of the value of the dollar and of not wasting a dollar or a minute of time.
I finally talked him into going fishing, and all of a sudden he disappeared. We looked around to find him, and he was back in the cabin reading the Wall Street Journal.
He defied conventional wisdom in terms of how much you could get done in a day, in a week, in a year, in a lifetime.
He maintained a pretty disciplined schedule.
He was prompt to be at the office at 8:30.
He would leave at 11 o'clock.
He would leave promptly at 11:30.
Lunch was to commence at 12:10, adhering to his strict schedule.
I know of many dinner parties where dessert hadn't been served and it was 9 o'clock and he would get up and leave.
He would say, it's time to go.
Check, please.
It didn't matter where he was, he could be eating with the Queen.
And so if you asked where he was, I'd tell you exactly and be accurate. He was that punctual.
He had a practice of walking a mile in shoulder-deep water.
Marching against the current up and down the beach.
Walking back and forth, maybe 50 yards.
I do remember when we were real little holding on to him, and he would drag us through the water.
He would put on pretty much the same outfit every day.
It was a regular sight.
He had a couple of bandages on his chest. He said the bigger fish have been biting me, but I've taken care of it. I'm having them removed. I thought, here we are in the ocean. He's going to have the fish removed. It turns out, a very practical solution. He went to spear fishermen, and he said, I'll pay you so much for each fish. So he solved his problem.
Every time you think you had him pegged, he would surprise you.
John's thrift, work ethic, and practical approach was reflected in what was becoming a remarkable track record. He started to attract investors of all stripes and colors.
The first annual meeting was in Toronto.
And we got one shareholder. One person showed up.
And then by the mid-'80s, it was getting up into 10,000 people.
It was though a rock star had arrived on stage when he came out. It was really an amazing event.
I was absolutely blown away.
They were truly pilgrimages.
We'd always start with a prayer.
He'd sit at the side of the stage and he'd start answering questions about any topic you can possibly imagine.
Somebody would ask about General Motors, but then you'd have people ask about, what advice can you give me about raising my children? And it was just the most extraordinary thing that I've ever seen.
You could have heard a pin drop in that room. It was almost as if nobody was breathing because they were hanging on every single word.
John spoke from the heart. He told it straight. If we'd had a bad quarter, he would tell them exactly that.
He often said, I'm wrong 1/3 of the time, and I'm right 2/3 of the time, and fortunately that carries us.
He was the first really kind of rock star investor where people would travel all the way to Toronto to hear what he had to say.
John's record speaks for itself. $10,000 invested in 1954 would have grown to over $2 million by the time he retired in 1992.
John allowed ordinary investors to achieve financial goals that they otherwise didn't have the opportunity to achieve.
Shareholders would say, after 30 years, my kids went to college, they got graduate degrees, you've really transformed my life.
When you see the many scandals in the investment world, and then you look back
And you see the long career of Sir John, and so principled.
He was honest. John Galbraith, in all the years that they'd worked together, they never had a legal written document.
There was not any contract.
He was careful to be very honorable.
He trusted people, and when you looked him in the eye and he looked you in the eye and you agreed on something, then that was good enough.
The word was his bond, and that was deeply important to him.
I remember in 1985, and the whole due diligence process to go public in London was extremely in-depth. The auditors could not believe that the firm had never been sued.
Legendary managers out on Wall Street, it meant a lot to them to get an allocation from John Templeton, not for the business, but because of what his standards were and what he represented as an investor.
I remember being in Tennessee and lying under the stars, and I wrote to Dad and said, "Why do I exist?" He wrote back and said, "Those are much too busy questions to deal with. You should deal with other things."
He was just an extremely busy man, traveling all over the world.
Uncle John had a very demanding, high-pressure job.
He was always working.
Discipline controlled his life so much that it was hard for him to allow emotion.
John was not a talking person, so to speak.
He bottled up everything.
Men of that generation were taught to keep their emotions in check.
Even though he didn't always seem to know how to show affection, John loved his children. No question about it.
I was walking with him one day. I said, "You know, Papa, your children really love you a whole lot." And he stopped and he said, "Do you really think so?" He was very complex. He was aloof, but he was totally kind.
In 1972, I got married. He said, "I'll drive you and I'll drive your bride." I mean, a white man driving a black man to a wedding, it was unbelievable. Never heard of it.
Love was one of the many big questions and mysteries of life that began to consume John. He brought his trademark open-mindedness and rigorous analytical thinking to these questions, to religion, and even to God.
It was really in the 70s that he started to become more spiritually curious.
John's spiritual exploration, like many things, started with his mother. A devout Christian, Vella thought beyond the traditional and encouraged her son to do the same, to ask hard questions.
John was a real skeptic about conventional theology.
I trace some of this back even to his boyhood. He was in Tennessee, where religion was a very confining, captive thing. The biggest game in town were the revivalists.
They were very restrictive in what you may and may not do.
They found that the framework was very confining.
His mother was listening to teachings from the Unity School of Christianity from the radio.
Unity is a freer, more liberal approach to the message surrounding God.
The religions I know are full of thunderbolts and fiery chariots, and Unity is kind of pastel. The pink blends into the purple and so on.
Armed with his mother's expansive thinking, John began searching.
I would say Uncle Johnny's most important question would be, why are we here?
The big questions were always bigger than big.
Was heaven possible?
He was a Tennessee mystic. He loved Big Bang Theory. He loved quantum physics.
Said to him one time, "You're interested in very big things and very little things. Cosmology and atoms." I've rarely met somebody who had more curiosity than he.
John came to the conclusion that although scientific advancement was accelerating exponentially, religion and theology were stuck in the Dark Ages. But centuries ago, religion and science progressed and advanced together, hand in glove.
The first hospitals were built by the church. Many doctors were monks and priests.
At the end of the 19th century, science and religion tended to go their separate ways.
Science became more dependent upon what you can see, what you can measure.
If I'm a scientist, I'm not going to touch religion. If I'm a religion, I'm scared of science.
Many people today, unfortunately, think that science and religion are still in some kind of conflict or warfare with each other.
Science can seem to be atheistic, and religion can seem to be dogmatic and stuck in old paradigms.
John felt that if you could get people who are very intelligent, atheists, theologians, hardcore physicists, mathematicians, if you could get them all together talking, that new information would emerge.
So we have here someone who knew that you couldn't answer the big questions in the conventional way. So he wanted to gather around him heretical, unusual, imaginative thinkers to think with him about the great problems.
To help attract and recruit the brightest scientists and theologians, John turned to the same method that his father had used to engage and inspire his own mind so many years ago: money. Establishing the Templeton Prize, the goal was to examine some of the big questions in life. Why are we here? Does God exist? Can forgiveness be studied? How about love?
John saw that Alfred Nobel had forgotten this area, and he felt it was so important. He made sure that the prize was always larger than the Nobel Prizes.
Templeton Prize winners have included a broad array of people, including Mother Teresa, writer and activist Alexander Solzhenitsyn, physicist Charles Towns, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
John Templeton did his most important work after he got his gold watch.
John earned a tremendous amount of money, decided he was going to devote that money to answering the big questions.
The prize was going to be after his will. And Irene, his wife, said, "Why aren't we doing it after you're dead? Let's start it now."
Lots of times, the scientific community would say, "Oh, you know, John, you can't possibly do scientific research on love. What are you thinking? Or forgiveness. There's just nothing there."
He expected some criticism, some flack for doing this.
Somehow scientists feel that something strange has gone here, that this is some fifth column, bringing religion back into science.
There were critics who said he must have an ideology.
John knew that not all of society would understand, and that didn't faze him. It had a parallel about his investing. When he invested in a company, if the market didn't see it and the prices went down, so much the better.
He once said to me, "Criticism is the fertilizer we grow in." And that means bring it on.
It took a long time for people to begin to take him seriously.
And I think he was willing to be open to all discoveries, no matter what it was.
John Templeton was an explorer. He insisted always on having good scientists doing good science. He never said, "Here's what I want you to find out."
He was a contrarian, somebody who did not follow the sheep.
John Templeton stuck to his convictions through hell and high water.
John Templeton was a value investor. And not just when it comes to stocks. He selected principles and virtues with the same kind of diligence. And that means that when he invested for the long haul.
He's made a bet that there's much more that we could learn.
Dad loved science because he felt that scientists do ask probing questions.
Why is the world built the way it is? Why is gravity the way it is? Do you want to understand why is it this way? And you realize that that cannot be completely supplied by science alone. Could we be alone? Is there life elsewhere? Is the universe going to stop and end or crunch at some point in the far future?
He got scientists and theologians who in the past had never spoken to each other, had just felt that they were enemies, really dialogue.
He's encouraged everybody to think carefully about religion and science. Religion asks, how did the world begin? What created it? And science says, well, how does it work?
But it all boils down to that last question, why are we here?
He said, who can know?
Who knows?
Do I think it'll be in my lifetime? No. And do I think it can ever be answered? I have no way of knowing that.
How little we know, how eager to learn.
How did life begin?
What are the implications of that?
Perhaps E.T. life?
Did you say E.T. life?
I did.
Who knows what we'll learn or find out?
There is enough work being done that we can hope to have significant or substantial quantum leap in answering this question within the next century.
It's almost guaranteed at the end of that they'll have 4 new big questions they couldn't have thought of at the beginning.
Ever the contrarian, John decided to make one last overarching bet against conventional thinking. He dedicated his entire fortune to the exploration of these big questions, to advancing spiritual discovery.
Nobody was interested in this kind of information before John Templeton started looking at these subjects and saying, what more can we learn?
So no one would have worked on virtue, courage, well-being, positive emotion, gratitude, forgiveness 15 years ago. John got the field going. And that was the big question, whether or not if you funded these great minds, whether or not they would come and ask questions which they would have considered embarrassing a decade before.
He cared about doing something that could have a major revolutionary effect on how people understood themselves.
Psychology, biology, the social sciences have been all about what's wrong with people, if you will, original sin forms of science. And where does original sin lead a human future? Well, no place. But if you believe that alongside our capacity for evil is a capacity for good, which sits there independently and has a very different evolutionary stream, then there is a possibility of a positive human future.
John's legacy was to combat the idea that the scientific answer, which you might find out in your lab, the one you can publish in the scientific journal, is where science finishes. John would see that as where science begins.
That's a neat legacy to kind of do what nobody else is doing.
John's going to be recognized as a Renaissance man in our own time, and there are very few people like that.
I think when they made him, they broke the mold. Yeah.
He will never be forgotten, and he will never be outdone.